Following months of trials in the Supreme and federal courts over the question, is this person a citizen of the United States, it will now be left off the 2020 census. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross confirmed the decision Tuesday, saying his goal is making sure there's an accurate and complete census count. The president, however, seems still determined to include the citizenship question, tweeting in part last night, "I have asked the Department of Commerce and Department of Justice to do whatever is necessary to bring the most vital of questions and this very important case to a successful conclusion."
USA, 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 yeah. By the way, on the end of that tweet. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that while the citizenship question is in fact legal, the rationale for its inclusion did not match the evidence that was provided. So despite the heated debate around the 2020 census, our next guests say that it is paramount for elected leaders to encourage full participation no matter the questions. In a recent op-ed, former Commerce employees, former Chief Counsel for Economic Affairs, Barry Robinson, and former Commerce attorney Edgar Chen debunk several concerns over the citizenship question's inclusion and stress just how important an accurate count is. And they join us now to expand on this and react to the recent news. Gentlemen, great to have you today. We really appreciate having your expertise at the table.
Great to be here.
Edgar, if you could start by just laying out for us, what all does the census determine? Why is this so important?
We wrote this piece because we want people to understand, just how important they are to the success of the census and how important a successful census is for them. Regardless of the Supreme Court's decision, we wanted to drive home the point that the census underwrites so much of the nation's both political and economic future. And, as we noted in the piece, almost $900 billion of federal funding distribution is at stake. We're talking, I have the numbers here. U.S. News had a great article detailing how much the census data is used to distribute things like education funding, school lunch programs, $19 billion, special education grants, $16 billion, Head Start, $9 billion. But we're also talking about Pell Grants, national highway funds, food stamps, Medicare. The census it touches so much of American public life here, and it's so important to make sure that it's done in an accurate way, that count is accurate so that, people get the resources that, they need where they are.
So, Edgar, this to me goes to a higher principle of sovereignty and of nationalism, of a country being able to determine who is in their borders and who's not. The census, Barry, was included in the census in 1950, this question about citizenship.
Yes.
Can you just give us some insight? Why was the question taken off in the first place?
It's my understanding, when I was the counsel for the census, that they decided that the efficacy of the question was no longer what it had been. There are other means by which they could take an estimation of the number of people who are citizens and those who are not, other data that's available. And so not to burden the census, because you get fatigue among respondents if you have lengthy questionnaires. That question was considered one that was not necessary for that purpose. There are other ways of getting that data.
Well, it's interesting, we should note that the level of 1950 was one of the lowest levels of illegal immigration and legal immigration. So it didn't have the same implications that we have now here. Is there any discussion in the Department of Justice? Because a lot of people don't understand this, but the Department of Justice actually had to weigh in on whether it was, whether the efficacy of this question and asking it, re-adding it to the census. Do we know what was there ever an effort to revive this question? And what was the thinking that the administration gave officially on why it should get back?
Right. The official rationale that was, in the administrative record here, what was purported was that this data was somehow necessary to help the Department of Justice enforce the Voting Rights Act. Okay. The problem that the Chief Justice and the majority of the court found was that essentially this was a pretext, that there was nothing to support this idea, and it really came down to kind of a Keystone Cops way of how this question came about. The Supreme Court decision talks about the Secretary's chief policy advisor struggling to come up with finding any rationale, just the best rationale to do this. So, you know, the court found that the question actually didn't come from the DOJ, but rather it was planted by the Commerce Department. They asked the DOJ to ask this question. I think, you know, we think that this ruling is, you know, you can disagree about the policy implications and other things, but we think this is a great victory for the rule of law. And, you know, to quote Justice Roberts, you know, the rule of law requires that the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs like the changes to things like the census here, has to ensure that agencies offer genuine justifications for important decisions. And I think we can all agree, census is pretty darn important.
Yes,
yeah,
very important.
and I mean, Barry, basically what they found, the Supreme Court, is that this wasn't about trying to help out DOJ. This wasn't even about getting accurate numbers. It was about political power.
I think that's a conclusion that many would come to. I can say this as a factual matter, and that is that when it was asked of the Census Bureau, presumably by DOJ, and Edgar has indicated to you the complications of that, but when the Department of Justice raised this issue of needing that data, we had not had any experience in our dealings with the Department of Justice and the Voting Rights Division for a need to have that data. So that was new. But moreover, when the assistant director, or deputy director, I'm sorry, of the census, Ron Jarman, invited, and this is a matter of public record, the Department of Justice to have its statisticians come over and discuss what data sets the census might be able to provide them with, other than burdening the census, they refused to do that. That's on the record.
Yeah. Well, this is what gets me about this entire thing, which is I understand from a researcher's perspective. I understand from from the means-tested programs that depend on this, but it just gets, like I said, to a higher ideal of why do illegal immigrants count towards congressional apportionment, and is there any way that you both legally know in order to solve for that, to make sure that it doesn't count towards that total? Because that's not something that the American people agree with broadly when you poll them. Yeah.
Well, you have numbers of people who are here in the United States who may not be documented, but they may be contributing to the tax base. They may be working gainfully. There are other people who are here who are green card holders, in other words, legal residents who are not citizens. But the members of Congress really have the obligation to make sure that goods and services flow to the entirety of their populations. The diminishment of some will have a negative impact
But
on
doesn't
the
that
others.
give an incentive to states like California, which is basically open and free to anybody who wants to claim asylum? They have sanctuary city policies. They're inflating their populations, and it could create an incentive in order to have more illegal immigrants that are counted as your population in order to get more seats, right? I mean, we can't deny that this is an obvious incentive.
Well, I think it's a matter of taking a look at the flows over history that have occurred, where states have said we've lost some population due to floods, hurricanes, and so on. The most stable way in which to manage this is to count the entirety of the populations of each of the states. They may ebb and flow depending upon societal changes or even natural disasters.
Right. Well, and I mean, the other thing, the flip side of what you're saying is that prison populations also count, even though inmates cannot vote. And that is a tactic that's used in a lot of red states and a lot of southern states. They get increased political power because prison populations are counted. I think that's a legitimate debate to have, but the problem is that that was not the justification given here.
No.
And the other thing I would say is, look, I know by law, right, this information, if undocumented immigrants do come out and fill out the census and say they're not citizens, by law, that cannot be used to deport them. But I also understand why you would not feel particularly comfortable giving your name to an agent of the federal government if you are here, undocumented.
Well, let's talk about that for just a second. We know that the controversies around immigration status have caused apprehension among elements that in the population that feel vulnerable. And if their participation rate decreases, then you have to spend more money in non-response follow-up activities. And even then, census people believe you're not going to get a full and accurate count. And that hurts everyone. The American public is going to be spending $15.6 billion in the anticipation that they're going to get a full and accurate count. The suppression of or the decrease in participation will amount to somewhere in the neighborhood of about an equivalent of the population of New Jersey. Mm-hmm. That is a huge deviation from what you would consider to be the norm.
Well, I think this is right. Barry's basically talking about the value proposition here. You know, is it worth compromising the integrity and accuracy of the entire census count and all of the benefits and, you know, for our nation's economy and political future, just to answer this narrow question on citizenship, which I think Barry indicated, you know, there are other means to get that through statistical...
more granular.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
More
Administrative
frequent
records.
than every 10 years.
Well,
Right.
here's the other question, which is the president says he wants to delay the printing. From a legal perspective, do either of you know if that's even possible?
I think yesterday the Department of Justice and the Department of Commerce confirmed that it's off to the presses already.
Right.
So without the citizenship question. So, you know, we think this is going full steam ahead, and hopefully this will send a message that, look, it's going to be safe, important and necessary to fill out that census.
How does the president not have the power to delay the census? I guess we should
it's
probably
not-
be happy that he doesn't, but like...
Because Article 1
Yeah.
of the Constitution says that the enumeration, which is the principal purpose leading to apportionment, shall be in such manner as they, meaning the Congress, shall direct. It's not given to the president.
That's
the only
interesting.
role that
Yeah.
the president
That is interesting.
has, based on my understanding of the law, and I think I've got a pretty good hold on this, is that he is to receive the report from the Census Bureau by a date certain that's prescribed in statute. If you back this up, you blow the statutory back-end deadlines.
Right.
Gotcha.
And so they were faced with a situation where the accordion effect would jam everything else that follows. Everything
If only we had
depends
some
on the step
competent
before.
lawyers in the Trump
Yeah, and so, I mean, this is a settled question for now, right?
Yes.
It's off to the presses. The citizenship question is not going to be there, but is it a settled question for the future? Could a future administration try to add this back in, maybe do it in less of a Keystone Cops type manner and be successful?
Well, I think that's always going to be a concern, but, you know, more importantly, the Census Bureau came out with a study in January called CBAMS, the Census Barriers, Attitudes, Motivation Survey. And they found that the biggest barriers to responding to the census are apathy, distrust in government, and lack of knowledge about what the census is used for. And we talked about all of the funding that you know, is determined by the census. And, you know, we think that, you know, our message in our op-ed, you know, continues to resonate, that we have to get information out there, that folks' responses are protected by law. If you know, breach that obligation, you face 5 years in prison.
Wow.
And several $100,000 in fines, and it's a lifetime prohibition
It's a
against
lifetime oath.
disclosure.
It's serious.
Really serious.
Gentlemen, this was great.
Yeah,
Really
very
appreciate it. Great to have your expertise.
Well, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for having
Thank
me.
you so much.
Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Absolutely. Next on Rising, Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska describes his efforts to secure former FBI agent Robert Levinson's release from Iran.
And he lays out how the Russian investigation became, quote, like a romantic Hollywood movie. Interested to hear what that's all about. That exclusive conversation with Hill TV's John Solomon when Rising continues.